What we are going to talk about today is employment income and treaty interpretation, and we're doing it discussing a case of Martin Fowler, a South African diver that worked for an oil company in the UK. So the first decision I discussed was that of the Court of Appeal, in which it was decided that Mr. Fowler was not taxable in the UK because he was treated as an entrepreneur and not as an employee. However, the UK Supreme Court came to the opposite conclusion and supported the upper tier tribunal, saying that Mr. Fowler was in fact an employee and subject to tax in the UK, and thus it reversed the Court of Appeal's return in favor of HMRC. So if we look and see what was going on here, the Supreme Court's introduction describes the facts. It says Mr. Martin Fowler is a qualified diver resident of the Republic of South Africa. From 11 till 13, he undertook diving engagements on the UK continental shelf. The preliminary issue is whether he undertook those engagements as employee or as self-employed contractor. HMRC claims that the income is subject to UK taxation. That depends on how the double taxation treaty applies. The treaty provides for employment income to be taxed where it is earned, in other words in the UK. But self-employed persons are taxed only where they are resident, and Fowler was resident in South Africa. So the matter was complicated by two factors, the court says. It says first, that certain employed divers doing the work Mr. Fowler did are under UK tax law treated as if they are self-employed. Second, that the terms of the treaty are to be given the meaning they have under tax law of the taxing state, in this case the UK. Thus, if the UK tax law's requirement to treat Mr. Fowler as self-employed governs the relevant treaty terms, the outcome might be that he is taxed as self-employed under the treaty and thus taxable in South Africa. This was the majority conclusion of the Court of Appeal, and this is indeed what we've seen. But note, it is the majority conclusion, right? There was a dissenting opinion from Lord Justice Henderson, and it read, "It is important to stress that the fundamental question is who has the right to tax Mr. Fowler's diving income, not how the government chooses to do so. Who has the right to tax in turn depends on what is being taxed." And then he went on to say, "I see the force of Mr. Schwartz's argument." Mr. Schwartz is Jonathan Schwartz, who is a barrister in the UK who represented Fowler. Schwartz, by the way, is South African by birth himself. And it says Mr. Schwartz's argument has its own internal logic. However, it confuses the two questions: what is taxed and how it is taxed. 1. Section 15, and that is the UK law that it refers to, applies in a particular factual situation described as someone who performed the duties of employment as a diver. We are asked to assume the existence of that factual situation. So in other words, Fowler was a diver qualifying for Section 15. Then Section 15(1)(c) recognizes that what is to be taxed is employment income. 15(2) also describes what is treated as trade. The scope of Section 15 is limited to those particular duties, i.e. it does not deem the employment itself to be the carrying on of a trade. So what Henderson says is you tax it as if it is trade, but it is not a trade. That's not what the section says. If Mr. Fowler carried out diving activities elsewhere or carried out other activities, only part of his remuneration would be treated as carrying on a trade, and the rest would very clearly not fall under the Section 15, because you only qualified if you were a diver and you worked for oil companies and you were doing work on the seabed on particular parts of the UK continental shelf, and the rest would be very clearly simple other employment income, because that is the chapter where Section 15 is appearing in. This is reinforced by Section 6.5, which recognizes that what is taxed under Section 15 is employment income. And this refers to different income tax, where I don't quote the right income tax years and laws here. You can see that in the decision itself. It's simply to give context to how this fits into the international treaty interpretation. The purpose of Section 15 is to describe the manner in which employment is to be taxed. This does not change the basic legal characteristics. The irrelevance of the manner in which the tax is levied is confirmed by Article 2 of the treaty. Mr. Schwartz's argument requires that the definition of enterprise in Article 3.1 of the treaty to include not merely a carrying on of a business, because 3.1 talks about what an enterprise and a business is, but also that it is deemed to be carrying on a business, and that is not what Article 3.1 of the treaty says. So let's see what the Supreme Court says. Chapter 17 or paragraph 17 of the Supreme Court decision says, it may be difficult to determine whether the services rendered by an individual resident of another state to an enterprise of the first state constitute employment services. This is what the Supreme Court quotes from the OECD commentary on Article 15 from paragraph 8.1, right? Constitute employment services to which Article 15 applies, or services rendered by a separate enterprise to which Article 7 applies. So what the OECD commentary says is sometimes it's not clear whether it's employment or whether it is services, right? The commentary recognizes that the national laws may focus on either the form or on the substance of the relationship. In other words, do you read the contract and follow that, or do you look at what's actually happening? At paragraph 8.7, it is acknowledged that the domestic law of the state applying the tax convention is likely to prevail, but subject to two qualifications, right? The first is that the context may require otherwise. This is expressly made in Article 3.2, where it says that you follow the national law if there is no definition in the treaty, unless the context otherwise requires. And then the second is that conclusion that under domestic law, a formal contractual relationship should be disregarded, but must, however, be arrived at the basis of objective criteria. For example, where services rendered by an individual may properly be regarded by a state as rendered in an employment relationship rather than as services between two enterprises, that state should also consider that the individual is not carrying on a business of the enterprise that constitutes that individual's former employer. In other words, it should be treated as an employee and not as an entrepreneur. And then the Supreme Court talks about deeming provisions, because there are more deeming provisions in UK law and in many other countries' laws. And now the court discusses how far do deeming provisions go, because if you watch the video on the upper tribunal, the Court of Appeal, then you would have noticed that the majority opinion there said, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. Once you've decided that the deeming provision applies and you have a fiction, you've got to follow it all the way. The Supreme Court decides different. The Supreme Court says there are useful but not conclusive dicta in reported authorities about the way in which statutory deeming provisions ought to be interpreted and applied. I love the language they use here. They are not conclusive, but they may fairly be said to point in different directions, even if not actually contradictory. They include the following guidance, which has remained consistent over many years. And then they quote a number of guidance points. The extent of a fiction created by a deeming provision is a matter of construction of the statute where it appears. Makes sense. For that purpose, the court should also ascertain the purposes for which and the persons between whom the statutory fiction is to be resorted to, and apply the provisions that far, but not where it produces effects which are outside those purposes. So you need to know what the purposes are, right? But then the Supreme Court raises a point. It says those purposes may be difficult to ascertain, and Parliament may not find it easy to describe with precision the intended limits of this artificial assumption. And then it comes to two conflicting conclusions. It says a deeming provision should not be applied so far as to produce unjust, absurd, or anomalous results unless the court is compelled to do so by clear language. But then it says in the fifth point, but the court should not shrink from applying the fiction created by the deeming provision to the consequences which would inevitably flow from the fiction being real. And this is what the Court of Appeal has done. So the Supreme Court lists the criteria from different decisions, but as is often the case, if you look at different decisions, one has a feeling that they may not come to opposite conclusions, but they definitely do not come to the same conclusions, right? And that's also what the Supreme Court says here in the first paragraph in this column. So if we look at the Supreme Court analysis and conclusion, the Supreme Court says nothing in the treaty requires Article 7 and 14 to be applied to the fictional deemed world which may be created by UK income tax legislation. Were it not for Section 15 of the income tax blah blah blah, there would be no doubt that Article 14, not Article 7, would apply. This makes sense. And then they say, so the question is whether Section 15 gives a different meaning to the relevant terms. That is not how a deeming provision works generally, nor does Section 15.2 in particular work that way, right? Section 15 is about the taxation of income arising from the performance of duties of employment, but introduced by the word instead, produce that the income is to be taxed as if, contrary to the fact, it was profits of a trade. So what the court says here, it's not that they say that you must treat this as income of a trade. They say it is employment income, but you should treat it like you treat income from a trade. And it all comes down to deduction of costs, as the court says next. It says, in short, nothing in Section 15 purports to alter the settled meaning of the relevant terms of the treaty. Rather, it takes the usual meaning of those terms as its starting points and erects a fiction which, applying those terms in their usual meaning, leads to a different way of recovering income tax from qualifying divers. Furthermore, Section 15 creates this fiction for the purpose of adjusting how the income is to be taxed. Remember that the dissenting judge also talked about not who is to be taxed, but how it is to be taxed, right? Or who can tax, but who is to be taxed. And then it says it does so for the purpose of specifically allowing a more generous regime of deduction of expenses. And this is what the Supreme Court decides, and I can see the logic of that. They says, you know, divers, they say it earlier in the decision, incur more expenses than other employees because they need to have special personalized diving suits and water bottle or air bottles, etc., etc. And therefore the Supreme Court goes on to say, if one asks, as is required, for what purpose and between whom is the fiction created, it is plainly for the purpose of adjusting the basis of a continuing UK income tax liability which arises from the receipt of employment income. Therefore, to apply the deeming provision in Section 15.2 so as to alter the meaning of the terms of the treaty with the result of rendering a qualifying diver immune from UK taxation would be contrary to its purpose. It would also produce anomalous results. Now, when it says its purpose, I don't know whether it means the purpose of the treaty. It seems to be more likely that what it says, it would lead to results contrary to the purpose of Section 15 itself, but the court is not very clear on that. And then the judge says, nor should Article 3.2 of the treaty be construed, and that is that you need to look at national law when the term like employment is not defined in the treaty, so as to bring a qualifying diver within Article 7 rather than Article 14. To do so would be contrary to the purposes of the treaty because it might lead to no taxation in South Africa, because remember, South Africa would then apply the treaty and its law according to the definition of employment in its law, and it would be very clear that the Fowler is employed in the UK because it's unlikely that South African law has a similar section as Section 15.2 in the UK legislation, and therefore South Africa wouldn't tax because they say, okay, right of taxation belongs with the UK, not with South Africa, right? This is because, as is recognized by Article 2.1, the treaty is not concerned with the manner in which taxes falling within the scope of the treaty itself are levied. It is simply allocating who can levy. For those reasons, the judge says, and then the other 4 judges concur, that he would allow the appeal, and HMRC ultimately wins this case, and Fowler is taxed on employment income in the UK. I think this decision is fine. I have no problem with it. I think this case could have gone either way. The one thing that I would say is I find the dissenting opinion of the Court of Appeal, Judge Henderson, similar to the Supreme Court decision, but much clearer. And I would invite you to go back and watch what Henderson said, because he's very clear. He says this is, this is about not who can tax, but Section 15 is about how it's taxed, right? I hope you enjoyed this case. It's an update to an older video, and I look forward to discussing the next case with you next time. Bye for now.